So our next guest is Dr. David Gordon. He has a Ph.D. in intellectual history from UCLA. He's a senior fellow at the Mises Institute and the editor of the Mises Review. It has been said that he's read every book. Today, he'll be speaking on the science of human action, Praxeology. Dr. Gordon.
Thank you for your introduction. Thank you, Durham, for inviting me. Let me see. So I'm supposed to lecture for an hour, and then if you have questions during the lecture, go ahead and ask them. You can also ask questions afterwards if we have time. I should say it's an hour unless I keel over. Before that, I'm an old man. I don't know how long I'll last. So I have to talk to you today about praxeology. We have to distinguish two closely related meanings. Word praxeology. One is the science of human action, and the other is the distinct method, deductive method used in that science. So sometimes people will speak of a praxeological method, meaning the deductive method used in logic, in praxeology. So I want to start with action as this is used in praxeology. An action involves the use of means, scarce means to achieve an end. So in order for someone to act, you have to have a goal or purpose in mind. Say you have the goal of learning about Austrian economics, so that's your goal. And then by enrolling in this program or coming to lectures, that's the means to achieve this goal. So you have a goal and then means to achieve the goal. And in order to act, you have to think that your means are going to get you to that goal. This is to be taken subjectively. Supposing, say, you think that there's someone you hate, you just can't stand this person, and you think that you'd like to kill this person, or at least to inflict harm on this person. And so that's your goal. And suppose you think a way to do that is to make a little wax replica of the person and then stick pins in the person. You say, well, if I stick pins in the right places, that will kill the person. So we could say, does that qualify as an action if we think we know that doing that won't get you what you want? Sticking pins in wax effigy of someone isn't going to injure them. At least it didn't the last few times I tried it. That was a joke. So if you're mistaken in thinking that, but it still qualifies as a means to an end as a means because you think it will get you what you want. Now, usually, but not always, acting will involve moving some part of your body. It doesn't always have to involve that. For example, suppose that, say you're working on a certain problem, so you could just think about it, you're trying to solve the problem, that would qualify as an action. Or sometimes you could take just waiting as an action. Now, can you think of an example that isn't either waiting just or thinking about a problem, where you're not doing anything, you're not moving your body at all, but you're still acting? Could anyone give me a case like that?
If you're thinking or meditating?
Well, yes, that would be one I mentioned that, but could you give me one that isn't like that?
Coma?
Which?
A coma?
Well, if you're in a coma, you'd just be out. You wouldn't have a purpose that you're trying to achieve. I mean, you could imagine somebody who's trying to get himself into a coma and say take some drugs to do that, but just being in the coma wouldn't be an action. Well, one example which I got from the great British philosopher Elizabeth Hanson would be this. Supposing, say, someone is leading a certain group, and they're voting on some measure. They're voting, and the chair of the meeting said, well, if you vote yes, please vote yes by remaining seated. So you remain seated, so by remaining seated, you voted yes. That's an action. Your end was to vote yes, and your means was to remain seated, but you didn't move any parts of your body. I'm sometimes given this example when I'm lecturing at the Mises Institute, and Peter Klein would give an example. He used to stand up to throw me off my stride. He's the sort of person who would do something like that. But generally speaking, an action it involves movement of your body. Now, question comes up, how do we know that we act? The answer Mises gives is that this is just a matter of common sense. We all know this from experience. We know what it is to have an end, to have means to an end, and to try then to act to achieve that. Now, some people at this point raise a difficulty. They say, well, look, maybe I would know from my own experience that I have ends, and I have means to achieve. I think there are means to achieve those. But how do I know that anybody else acts maybe this would just show that I act, not anybody else. But Mises doesn't view it that way, neither does Rothbard. Murray Rothbard, they just take it as a matter of ordinary experience that we're aware that people are acting. This is just a matter of ordinary observation. That I can see, say that people are listening to my lecture and taking notes on my lecture. So I see that that's happening. It isn't something that I just know about myself. And this brings up an important point that many people get wrong. No matter how many times I've lectured on this, people will still raise this point. They'll say, well, how do I know that there are any other minds at all? Supposing, for all I know, you could be robots who have been programmed to respond in certain way. How do I know that there's anything going on in your minds? And the point to that's a very interesting philosophical question. But the very basic point to realize is that although Austrian economics, praxeology, is concerned with issues that are relevant to philosophy, it's not an attempt to solve a philosophical problem of skepticism. It isn't a matter of saying, well, can I give some sort of proof that there are other people around who act that is immune to skeptical doubt. That's not what is done in the sciences. And remember, economics, praxeology, is one of the sciences. So just as in physics, say physicists would rely on certain observations, he would say, he would look at his measuring instruments and get certain readings from it. He wouldn't raise the question, how do I know I'm seeing anything at all? How do I know that there really is a world out there? That kind of question isn't one that a scientist would ask. Thank you. That was an excellent example of human action means to achieve it. So I say it's not an attempt to solve the problem of philosophical skepticism. Now, at this point, there's an argument that's sometimes given that I'll mention, which I think is all right, but I don't put as much stock in it as some people do. And this is the argument that goes like this. Suppose somebody denied that human beings act. Say, human beings don't act. So the argument is, well, when he's saying that, he himself is acting. He has a goal in mind. He wants to deny that human beings act. And he has a means to achieve that goal, namely sane human beings act. So by acting, he's contradicting himself in certain ways. It's called performative contradiction. It's by acting, by saying I can't act, he could only say that if he in fact could act. So he's self-refuting himself. So that argument is all right, but the reason I don't put as much stock in it as some people do is that supposing all you get from that argument is we know that there's at least one action, but that wouldn't tell us, that wouldn't suffice to tell us that action, that we can get important ideas about human conduct from the study of action. It would just be example of one action. So somebody, say, was skeptical about praxeology could say, all right, well, okay, maybe there is an action or two. I'm not denying that all action, that there are any actions at all, but I don't think that's a very useful concept. So we're going to not, so I don't want to use that in founding economics. So just using this performative contradiction argument wouldn't refute that person. Now, supposing then, so we're satisfied, we start with action. Now, what is the method that we use in Austrian economics? Is a deductive method. And people's the key point to remember here is that in deduction, if oh, here we go again. Yes. Oh, thank you. Thank you again.
You say
I'm sure I'll succeed in spilling this. Try to stop it out and out. So the key point is, if in deductive reasoning, if we start with a true premise, whatever is validly deduced from that premise is also going to be true. And we start, say, with any premise that's true if we deduce various things from it. If our starting point is true and we've deduced correctly, then our conclusion will also be true. Now, what happens, say, if we start with a false premise and then we deduce various things from the false premise and we reason correctly in doing that? Supposing, say, I start with the premise, all men are mortal, Socrates was a man, therefore Socrates was immortal. That's a valid deduction. The premise is false. So what is it always the case that if I start with a false premise and deduce that the steps validly from that, will it always be the case that the conclusion is false? Does anybody have any idea? Yeah.
Well, from what I know about logic, I think
false premises can lead to correct conclusions.
Again, yes, that's right. That the point would be that if your premise, if that happens, the false premise doesn't give you good grounds for accepting the conclusion, but you have validly deduced it. So if you start with a true premise, reason validly from it, then your conclusion will also be true. This is much more important, although we'll go into this, into how we know the premise is true that we start with. There are various opinions on that that I'll be going into. The most important thing is that we reason correctly, deduce validly from what we started with. Now, then the question comes, well, what do we mean by deduction? The type of deduction that the Austrian praxeologists engage in is deduction in ordinary language rather than, say, symbolic logic. Have any of you had courses in symbolic logic? Oh, you have. Well, the question would come up, why do we want to do it this way in, say, if you have a symbolic logic, you can just make sure your deductions are right because you just, as long as they follow the rules, you will come up with the right answers. Isn't it easier to find out whether you've done the right thing if you're going according to symbolic logic? And the Austrian point would be, it might be easier to find out, but on the other hand, you don't understand every step that you're taking in the deduction. You're just interested in you start with your opening premise, you know that, and then you get to the conclusion, but you don't understand why each step follows. So in the Austrian view, understanding why each step follows is of great importance, and this is outweighs any edge in say, ease of finding a mistake that you would get if you use symbolic logic. So, again, we're just using ordinary logic, just the logic that people use in everyday reasoning. Say, sometimes people will say, well, aren't there different sorts of logic? There's intuitionist logic, there's apparent inconsistent logic. There are all sorts of different logical systems, but this isn't what we're using here, is just ordinary reasoning, ordinary language. Now, I should say also that there's, when we're talking about action, there are certain principles that Mises and Rothbard use that sometimes other economists don't. one of these is that when we're acting, we're not trying to maximize utility if this is taken as some sort of measurement, or some quantity that we're trying to get the most of. So sometimes people will say, well, coming to this lecture, I'm coming to this lecture because that maximized my utility. It isn't that there's some quantity of utility, which is something like dollars, that I'm trying to get the most units of. It's just what I'm trying to do is I have various preferences, things that I want to do. And I'm trying to, what I want to do is to choose the preference that is at the time highest on my preference scale. So if, say, you're here, that indicates that coming to this lecture was ranked first on your preference scale. That was what you wanted to do. It isn't that coming here will give you, say, 10 units of utility, and your next alternative will give you, say, 8 units of utility. So that's why you came here. It's just that your preference will have this rank high. So we say in Austrian economics, the preferences are ordinal, not cardinal, meaning you have a ranking, like what is your first preference, or second, and so on. And we don't say there's a cardinal measure of utility, so it's just first, second, third, and so on. And one other, this is different, say, from the way in mainstream economics, they will say they're not measuring utility, but what their approach to utility is will involve something that's very light measuring utility if it doesn't meet all the requirements. So it's the Austrian view is much less, involves much less apparatus, mathematical apparatus, and just all you have is ordinal preference. Another point there with Austrian is the view is different from the mainstream view, is that we don't accept transitivity of preference. Now, what does transitivity of preference mean? Say, if, say, I prefer apples to oranges and oranges to bananas, then I prefer apples to bananas. It couldn't be that I prefer A to B, B to C, but C to A. That would be an example of intransitive preference. And in Austrian economics, we don't assume that because the preferences, the transitivity assumes that preferences are stable over a period of time, and we don't assume that. So we're rejecting transitivity of preference. Now, another point where the Austrian view doesn't accept the notion of difference. They say something difference can't be shown in action. That's to say, supposing if I had the question, would I rather drink this water or not drink it? Say right now, would I rather have a sip of water or not have a sip of water? I could demonstrate that I prefer one or the other, either by sipping the water now or not sipping it now. But I couldn't demonstrate that I don't care. It's a matter of indifference to me which one it is. So in the Austrian view, we can't demonstrate indifference in action. And so Austrians don't use indifference curves, which is one of the most important tools in ordinary neoclassical economics. And also, the Austrian, which is just related to the point I made, preference is demonstrated in action. If something isn't, don't act on something that for the purposes of Austrian economics, we can't tell whether that's all we know. We can't know, say, if you say you prefer oranges to bananas, but that wasn't one of your options at the time, that can't be. We don't know that. We can't use such a concept. We can't use that preference in reasoning. Now, we now get to this question I mentioned that's much disputed, which is how do we know that our starting point is, how do we know, not just the starting point, how do we know that the steps we're taking are true? As we deduce them valid, what kind of reasoning are we engaged in? And in the Austrian view, and there are two variations here. According to Mises, we're using a priori reasoning, which is reasoning, knowing something to be true just by thinking about it, but when we nevertheless know that it applies to the real world. So according to Mises, just by thinking about the notion of action, deducing things from this, I can know truths about the real world, say. Now, some people said, look, how can that be? You can't, just by thinking about something, that's just going to lead you to other thoughts of yours. You can't know something that's true about the world just by thinking in your head. All you could get there is other ideas. And the question there would be, we want to know why, what is the basis for saying that? And usually there isn't one that's given. People just say, well, it's obvious that's true, but that's just the point of issue. Is it true? And it would appear, and this is a point that Mises makes in one of his last books, The Ultimate Foundation of Economic Science, if people say there's no such thing as an a priori truth about the world, there's something called a synthetic a priori truth. That itself is a synthetic a priori truth about the world if it's true. So that again would be one of these statements that by making it refutes itself. As a person saying there's no synthetic a priori truth, but he's claiming that that itself is something that is known by just by thinking about it. If he tried to say, well, maybe it isn't, he's just looked around and he doesn't find any synthetic a priori truth, that again begging the question, because Mises would say, no, yeah, here are some synthetic a priori truths. This is, and then give examples of it. So there isn't any principled reason, philosophical reason for denying the existence of synthetic a priori truths. Now, one confusion sometimes people make is when we talk about a synthetic a priori proposition or a judgment, say, human beings act, that would be a judgment. That doesn't follow from the fact that we have a synthetic a priori judgment or proposition, sentence, that the terms in that proposition themselves all a priori. So it isn't a good, there are examples we could come up with where something is a synthetic a priori truth, but the terms, the concepts that are used in the truth are not themselves a priori concepts. Could anybody give me an example of that kind? Okay.
Well, I don't have an example, but I do have a question.
Yeah,
Regarding the term synthetic,
yeah.
I'm confused about what synthetic means in regards to synthetic a priori.
Oh, again, it's a very good question because there are different meanings it could have. One would be, we have to first understand what an analytic truth is. An analytic truth is something that is either a truth, a logic, or part of a truth, logic, or a truth in which the predicate of the sentence is part of the subject. Say, suppose we say all bachelors are male. So that's part of the definition of a bachelor is an unmarried male, so analytic. Now, in another sense of synthetic, it would mean something that is true about the world. So that's, you have to. So in Austrian economics, if it says that there are synthetic a priori truths, that would mean say there are truths about human action that apply to the world. But an example to answer my own question, suppose we take, which some people say is synthetic a priori, nothing can be red and green all over at the same time. So that, at least is claimed plausibly so, that's something we can know to be true just by thinking about it. But the terms red and green, it would seem like you said, those aren't a priori concepts. We just know what they are. If somebody, just by ostension, by pointing them out, somebody said, what does red mean? We could check. The only way really to answer that is to point to various red objects until the person is able to tell what we meant. It doesn't have a definition in the sense we're using it here. So it's not an a priori concept. And a second point, which is related to this, is that an a priori proposition is a claim. When we say this proposition is a priori, we're saying how we can know it to be true. It's something we can know to be true just by thinking about it. But it isn't a view of how we get our concepts. So somebody could have the view that we get concepts from the empirical world, say, by abstracting them. But this person who thought that could still accept a priori truth, because it isn't a matter of where the concepts come from, but what you do with them once you have them. Now I mentioned earlier that Murray Rothbard has a rather different view from that of Mises about the nature of reasoning, praxeology. So he says that when we're reasoning, we start with the action acts and the human beings act. But this is something that we know empirically just by observation. And he holds that we not only can get by observation that certain things are true, we can also directly grasp what must be the case, what's necessarily the case in certain instances. So we can see that it's true that human beings have a property, necessary property of acting. This is a necessary truth about human beings. It couldn't be otherwise. And this is a controversial position in philosophy, because some people say all we can grasp about the world empirically is just what may or may not be true. What's contingent, I can't grasp necessarily that something necessarily must be the case. But the view that Rothbard gives is one that has certain good deal of support in philosophy. It's one that Aristotle held, St. Thomas Aquinas, in more recent times. It's been defended by the great American philosopher Saul Kripke. So, according to Rothbard, we go according to what's necessary rather than what's a priori, in the sense that we know it to be true just by thinking about it. In Rothbard's view, we go know what is, we directly grasp what must be the case. Now, just to make sure you get the key distinction here, Mises' claim is about how we know. It's a matter of epistemology, which is the branch of philosophy that studies how we know things. And Rothbard's claim is about metaphysics. It's about what is or isn't the case. It's a matter of what the nature of the world is. Sometimes people call this ontology. What is the case, rather than what must be. Yes.
I don't want to interrupt your thought.
Oh, go ahead. There's not much to it.
Okay. So today's theme is primarily centered around deductive versus inductive reasoning. And part of the debate before you got here was inductive methodology has made economists a slave to policymakers. Essentially, we use math and statistics to justify what people tell us they kind of want. But what would a mainstream revival of praxeology and deductive methodology in economics make of us?
So the question is, what the relation would be to policy, or no?
So if inductive reasoning made us slaves,
Yeah.
what would inductive reasoning, what would deductive reasoning make of us?
Oh, I see. So the argument would be that in inductive reasoning, we're taking what people say they want and then using that as a guide to policy. So in that way, we're slaves to what they want. Well, deductive reasoning would be then a way of freeing the slaves, and people would say, here's what follows, whether you want it or not. This is the consequence of this true statement that we start with. So supposing, say, the Austrian economist said that minimum wage laws will cause unemployment, other things be equal. So then that's true. Even if people say we want minimum wage laws, it's still true that it causes unemployment. Now, your question is a very good one, and it gives me one other point I want to discuss, is that Austrian economics is Mises and Rothbard both agree on this, is a value-free science, not in the sense that, let's say it's descriptive rather than normative science. So we'll say something like minimum wage laws cause unemployment. Now, for most people, that will be a reason not to have minimum wage laws. People don't want unemployment. But strictly speaking, that isn't that conclusion isn't part of Austrian economics. You would have, that would be a value judgment that you have. I don't want unemployment, so I shouldn't favor minimum wage laws. And it's easy to do. We can say, we can kind of take for granted that in certain cases that people will have, or at least almost everyone will have certain preferences. So this point really doesn't matter, but it is a major theoretical point. One example that Mises gives in this connection is supposing a doctor says to you, you should give up smoking because smoking will increase your chances of getting cancer. So when the doctor says that, he's assuming that you don't want to get cancer, but very few people do want to get cancer, so we can just act as if everybody has that preference. But strictly speaking, the claim that the statement that smoking will give you cancer is value-free. And a point there is that this view that there's this distinction between descriptive and normative statement doesn't involve, is not a version of ethical relativism. Some people hold the view, might be mistaken, that there's no such thing as objective ethics in the sense that they'll say ethical judgments are simply expressions of preference. So you can hold that ethics is objective, meaning that they're right and wrong answers to the question, is something ethically good or bad, that hold regardless of people's preferences, but still hold that isn't part of Austrian economics. That was actually the view that Rothbard held. He thought there was an objective science of ethics based on natural law, but he didn't think that that was part of economics. And another point that's relevant there is that when we're talking about Austrian economics or developing, we're making statements about the values people have. When we say someone prefers or values apples to oranges. So that's a statement about their preference, but it isn't itself a value judgment. It's a statement about values. I remember one time in one of my lectures to the Mises Institute, I made this point. I said that say some people, or late part, I said, some people argue against ethical relativism. You that all judgments of value are relative. They say, some people say, well, that's a self-refuting claim. Somebody says, all ethical judgments are relative. The person thinks that's true, but if he's right, that's just a relative statement on his part, so he's refuting himself. Would people think that's a good argument?
So the greater arc of the response to my question is the current way we do things, we are a normative power in the workforce. We, help decide everybody else's kind of thing that they do. But in a world where economics is more descriptive than normative, as we would like, would that simply make us the bearers of bad news and we leave the moral relativism to the other decision makers in the room?
No, because then we would have our own normative judgments and we would have a basis for use the Austrian method as a result to help us get grounds for those. But I don't think that's a good argument. One I gave, which was that relativism is self-refuting because the person who says that is himself making a judgment about, he's maybe saying something that he doesn't think is relatively true. He says it's true that there are no relative judgments in ethics. So is that self-refuting? And I don't think it is, because it's a statement about truth in ethics. It's not itself an ethical claim, the kind the person is claiming to be relative. But the reason I mention this now is that when I said this, people in the class, are we out of time?
5 minutes.
Oh, when I said this, people in the class started laughing. They thought it was a joke, and I intended it as a serious comment. So if there's one thing that's worse than people not laughing at my jokes, that itself is pretty bad. It's people who do laugh at what I take to be a serious comment. That's really going too far. So now in the few minutes left, I want to ask a question that I'm sure will have occurred to many of us. Why should we bother about any of this? Why should we care about this praxeology? These questions I've been asking. Why don't we just go ahead with economics and just deal with that? Why should we go through all these rather difficult philosophical reasoning? Why bother about it? Well, of course, one reason that's very important for me is that talking about this keeps me in business. That's why they hired me to give lectures like this. But probably a more serious reason is very relevant to policy, is that if we correct in what we're reasoning, then we don't need to test out what we've said by empirically. Now, say, supposing we have an argument, I think we got to one that minimum wage laws cause unemployment. then we don't need to start testing this and say, well, such and such, they imposed a minimum wage law here, what was its effect on employment? We know that the statement is true, so I think this gives us an advantage in recommendations and policy because we're not hostage to empirical data in the way that those who don't accept the methodology that we use are, say, the neoclassical view. They will come up with deductive models, but then they will try to test them out. They'll start with one that say, they'll say, well, these are unrealistic assumptions, and then we'll, say, well, can we come up with something? Does a test show it's close to the truth? So this is the way to do things in posture economics. So I think I'll conclude with a comment I owe to my late friend, Father James Sadowski, which was, since I talked about philosophy, he said, he used to say about philosophy, the word philosophy comes from the Greek word philosophia, which means philosophy. So thanks very much.
Any questions?
I kind of have one. I don't know if this is, so I'm new to economics, so pardon my ignorance of my question. But like, I don't know the history of the minimum wage laws. Is that something, if you're familiar with, like that the people wanted, or is that a government intervention?
There were people who wanted them. I mean, there's sometimes workers who think, well, they'll think their wages will go up if there's minimum wages, and they don't realize it will say if they're doing work that the employer doesn't value at the new minimum wage, then they'll be out of a job, so they're not taking that into account. There are people who wanted that. I mean, they're government officials who favor it for their own reasons, and sometimes labor unions favor that because they think it will prevent competition from unionized workers. Say the union gets a certain wage rate where its employees, then one thing a firm can do is try to find workers who will accept a lower wage than the union, the rate the union has got. So in some cases, if there's a minimum wage, the employer can't do that, so that would be an example.
I kind of missed the point where you didn't believe in the veracity of like the Mises' performative contradiction about the axiom of action. Could you just explain it again?
Oh, well, the point was the performative contradiction is that if I say people don't act, that itself is an action. So I'm contradicting myself when I say that, and I thought that's perfectly all right. But if, say, somebody is an opponent of praxeology, the opponent could say, okay, fine, I'm not saying there's no such thing as action, but I just don't think that's very useful in getting science and economics. We can't do much with it. So that person isn't refuted by this point.
So once again, with the like inductive versus deductive reasoning, the question of what role does math play in deductive reasoning, if ever, or to the Austrian economist, what is mathematics? Like, yeah, what is it?
Oh, well, sometimes Austrian economists can use math sometimes in illustrating certain points, but it isn't part of the actual process of deduction. I see that. I mean, as to the Austrian wouldn't be committed to any views about what the nature of mathematical truth is. So, I mean, there are, say if you had, say, an example, say, demand and other things being equal, if there is a decrease in price, the quantity demanded will increase. So you could give numerical illustrations of that. So you could say, well, that's using math. So that might be an example where you can use math, but it isn't primary or central.
So just to kind of continue, since everybody else is flying on the questions, so the difference between like the neoclassical school being in charge of economics as like a wheelhouse of knowledge, if we were to transition to like praxeology and Austrian economics, would that be taking economists as like glorified statisticians to lawyers? Like, would we become more of wordsmiths than number slingers?
Well, yeah, in a sense, yes, we would be using more words, although it is true that lawyers use words. I don't think that would make us lawyers, at least I hope not. Yes, you know the one, what do they say? What do you call 1,000 lawyers at the bottom of the ocean? A good start.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.